Hello, and welcome to a very special edition of Firearms Friday from the Wyoming State Museum here in Cheyenne. We have a special guest with us today and also a very special rifle to talk about as a lead-in to our discussion on a particular encounter with Native Americans in 1879. This is an Officers Model Trapdoor Springfield, and it is unique in that there were only 477 of these particular rifles made at the Springfield Armory. Officers in the American military at that time had broad discretion as to the firearms that they used and carried, both their sidearms and their long guns. This was available for purchase. It was not an issued firearm, but it was available for officers to buy. And it is very similar to, the action is really the same as the standard issue carbines and rifles that were adopted by the United States military in 1873 and were still in use as late as the Spanish-American War. They were called Trapdoor Springfields because of the way the action worked. In order to load this firearm, you would cock the hammer and then open the action with this lever, kind of like a trapdoor. And as you swung this over, it would pop out the fired cartridge and allow you to insert the next round into the chamber, which you then closed that action and you were ready to fire. So in this period between 1873 and the Spanish-American War, the cavalry was issued a carbine version, shorter than this rifle in front of us, because it was easier to handle on horseback. The infantry was issued a rifle that was similar but had a full stock clear out to the end of the muzzle. What made these special were a couple of features. One, there's a lot of very fine engraving on the rifle. It's the top of the butt plate is engraved. There's engraving here behind the action. There's engraving here on this boss which the trapdoor rotates through. And they were also checkered. Both the butt, the wrist here was checkered, as well as the forend was checkered. This is quite worn, particularly the forend checkering is quite worn. The other interesting addition that would have not appeared on the stock firearms at the time was this pistol grip that was added on. In addition, when the rifles were issued, they had a tang sight, and the tang sight was mounted on this plate, on a plate that sat right here. The plate is missing. So what's the story? What's the Wyoming connection with this particular Officers Model rifle? Well, it was owned by a Major Thomas Thornburgh, who was the commanding officer at Fort Fred Steele in Wyoming. Fort Fred Steele is about 20 miles east of Rawlins. It was originally constructed to protect the workers on the Transcontinental Railroad. So, in 1879, Thomas Thornburgh was the commanding officer at Fort Fred Steele. He was subsequently involved in a fight, the Battle of Milk Creek. Thank you. And our guest here today is Dr. Mark Miller, and he wrote this book, an excellent reference book on the fight at Milk Creek. So if you're looking for one of these, they are available. It's out of print, unfortunately, but available on the secondary market and quite expensive. My first read through, I retrieved it through interlibrary loan from the University of Wyoming. So there are other books out there. This is absolutely the best and most well-researched. So, Dr. Miller, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about what led up to the fight at Milk Creek?
Sure. Briefly about the gun, we think in the fall of 1879, Thornburgh was planning a hunting trip, and I think his brother was out here, and they were going to go hunting, and they were going to use Taylor Pennock as their guide, who was very familiar with the Snowy Range in the area. And at about this time, there was a lot of unrest with the Ute Indians in the White River Agency in northwestern Colorado. In the summer of 1878, Nathan Meeker, who was kind of a fanatical agricultural reformer, he'd started a utopian colony around present-day Greeley in Colorado, and it was met with mixed success, and so he left and went to work for Interior as an Indian agent at White River. When he got there, he brought his extreme views about agricultural productivity and the problems with Native Americans with him, and he tried getting the Utes to give up their hunting and gathering way of life and their horse racing in Powell Valley, and he wanted them to plow Powell Valley up and plant crops.
And this was probably not unusual at this time, as that there were other agents at other reservations who were attempting to make the Native Americans give up their nomadic and hunting lifestyle and settle down and be farmers. Mostly not well met by the Native Americans.
Oh, exactly, and it's a conflicting worldviews. And the difference between this one and some of the ones in Arizona and other places is the Powell Valley. It was great soil, great place to grow crops. But the Utes had a racetrack there. And they fought Meeker over that change in behavior, that change in land use, and it led to a brief scuffle between Meeker and Johnson, who was a Ute leader of one of the bands at the agency at White River.
So this led Meeker to ask for assistance, to reach out for the military.
Right, which is kind of surprising. I thought the smart move would have been to contact Department of Interior, but he wanted military assistance to help him with the Ute problem. And he sent a letter that worked its way through the War Department and trickled down to Omaha Barracks, where General Crook was, and he'd essentially asked for soldiers to help keep the Utes on the reservation, not let them off the reservation to hunt or to buy ammunition, and essentially to guard the reservation boundaries so he could establish a store on the reservation and sell all the products that the Utes needed himself, rather than all of the free enterprise things between Rawlins and White River.
It was also, I think, not uncommon that the Indian agents at various reservations took advantage of their position to shortchange the Native Americans and profit from their position as agent and being in control of supplies.
Oh, exactly. And at the same time, there was a consultant or a contractor who had the responsibility of delivering annuity goods to the Utes. And he got crossways with the Union Pacific and the powers that be, and a businessman in Rawlins was holding the annuity goods in storage there, and they had been for a couple years. Sure. So the Utes didn't even have their annuity goods because of something they had no control over.
So how did Thornburgh then get called into this difficult situation?
Well, Thornburgh was a commanding officer at Fort Fred Steele, which was the nearest military base to the White River unrest. And when he got the vague orders from Crook about going down there and arresting such Indian chiefs as were insubordinate and enforce the requirements to Agent Meeker, whatever that meant, he tried getting Taylor Pennock to guide the White River expedition. But Pennock couldn't get away from the agreement he did to guide Thornburgh's brother on the hunt, and so he didn't go. And the story I get is that Thornburgh gave this weapon to Pennock at that point to use during the hunt, and presumably saying, I'll pick it up when I get back.
And he never came back.
And he never came back. And it was in the Pennock family, I think, for decades and decades and decades. And I don't know exactly if they donated it to the museum, but them or the next owner did. So it's a pretty sound chain of custody.
You were actually peripherally involved with the expert who did examine this rifle and commented positively on its provenance as being a Thornburgh rifle.
Oh, he's convinced. Was C. Vance Haynes, a professor of geology out of Arizona, and an expert on Springfield weapons and weapons of the 19th century Indian wars. And he looked at it. Jim Allison let him come up.
Supervisor of collections here and my mentor.
Yeah. And together they looked at, I think, every component on the rifle, and all little pieces. Something's missing or one thing's replaced, but generally speaking, this is unquestionably the weapon that Thornburgh purchased a month before he was killed.
So he rounded up some soldiers, cavalry and infantry. How many and how far away were they from the reservation?
He didn't have much time. It seemed like there was kind of a rush on this because Meeker was really frantic. So Thornburgh got 2 companies of cavalry, 5th Cavalry from Fort D.A. Russell, and he had 1 company of 3rd Cavalry at Fort Steele and 1 company of 4th Infantry there. And so he took that body of troops as the White River Expedition plus about 25 wagons. They didn't take any artillery, they didn't take any sabers, but they did have their handguns and carbines and a suitable amount of ammunition, and they went down there to enforce the requirements of Agent Meeker and arrest Johnson at least, if not more.
So it was like, 150 miles or so from Fort Fred Steele to Milk Creek?
I think around 170 miles to Milk Creek from Fort Steele, and then another 20 miles or so from there to the agency. Yeah.
So what happened when they got to Milk Creek?
Well, they traveled as quickly as they can, but they weren't in a rush, so they were careful in their travel. And during that period of moving down to Milk Creek, Ute Jack or Chief Jack, another leader of the Utes, met them on the way, and he was bilingual.
This Captain Jack or
Nakagat. And he had actually served as a scout with the 3rd Cavalry during the Rosebud Battle in 1876. And they knew each other, and they talked back and forth. And there was concern on the part of the Utes that there were so many soldiers going down to the reservation. So he kind of talked Thornburgh into maybe coming on with 5 troops to the reservation and have a parley when he got there. Thornburgh wanted to move the whole command closer before he did that. And he sent a letter from there to Meeker, asking Meeker to come out onto the road so he could take part in that discussion. He gave that letter to Charlie Lowry, who was one of his guides, and Charlie took it towards the agency, met some of his friends along the way, and they played a bunch of Keno or something, and they got drunk, and he was way late getting to the agency, and that delay helped cause a lot of the frustration.
So Milk Creek was basically the boundary of the reservation, and Thornburgh crossed it. Why?
It is, yeah, it's the traditional boundary. It's the one that's easiest to see on the landscape, so everybody used that. The legal boundary was a little further north, but that didn't matter. It was Milk Creek. And when they got there, Thornburgh was ready to take his 5 troops on across and go, but when they got there wasn't hardly any water in Milk Creek. And the Indians, the Utes, had burned the forage away because they were worried that the troops were coming, and so it was a fairly inhospitable creek valley at that point. And Joe Rankin, who was their guide, suggested there's more water on Beaver Springs up near Yellow Jacket Pass, a few miles onto the reservation. Let's go there. And
so they crossed Milk Creek.
So they crossed Milk Creek, and they took a shortcut.
Right.
The wagon road to the agency follows the creek to the Danford Hills and then turns north towards Yellow Jacket Pass. Well, there was a cutoff that cut a few miles of that off, and the troops ended up taking that because the wagons were 2-3 miles behind them.
So, and the Utes perceived this as an invasion of the reservation at this point?
Yeah, they were actually ready to ambush the troops if they crossed onto the reservation on the road to Yellow Jacket Pass, and they were already in position to do that. And most of them were the young, firebrands, And once the troops decided to cross in force, to the Indians' viewpoint and a lot of other people, the soldiers violated the sovereignty of the reservation. And one of the lieutenants took a small group to the Utes after the Utes saw they'd been maneuvered, and the Utes were starting to cover the advance. And Lieutenant Cherry went there with a small group, and a shot from the Utes rang out, whizzed by Cherry, and all hell broke loose then, and the troops fell into their skirmish lines and had to retreat back towards where the wagons were being circled.
And Thornburgh was killed fairly early in this encounter, is that right?
During that retreat, yeah, he commanded the retreat back, and one of the Captain Payne of the 5th Cavalry to dislodge some Utes off of a hill that gave them a good angle firing into the wagons. And that was the last order he gave. He was riding back to the wagon train, circling, when he was shot.
So the wagons did the traditional thing you see in the movies of making a circle.
Yeah, about a 3/4 circle, and then they dug fire pits, not fire pits, but entrenchments, and moved the contents of the wagons out to give protection and stuff like that. And that's where they fought from September 29th, after the retreat, until October 1st. The night of September 29th, Joe Rankin, their guide, snuck out and rode horseback all the way back to Rawlins, and they telegraphed Fort D.A. Russell to bring reinforcements, and 2 or 3 other riders did the same thing to other locations.
And there was a small contingent of Buffalo soldiers from the 9th Cavalry that got involved in the action. Is that right?
Yeah, Captain Dodge of the 9th Cavalry, I think it was Company D, was on maneuvers out of Fort Lewis, Colorado. And they were somewhere around Middle Park. And one of the guides that rode out at the same night as Joe Rankin went towards Steamboat and then toward Middle Park and ran out of courage. So he left his note about the attack on a sagebrush by the main road. And a few hours later, Dodge and his company were riding by and picked up the notice and rode toward the battle.
Wow. So one of the points you made in your book is that this fight was somewhat unique in that the length of time involved, that it started on the 29th of September and they were not finally relieved until what, the 5th of October?
Right, it was 6 days and nights, and it was long, and it was essentially a siege. After the 2 companies retreated to the wagons where the 3rd company was guarding them, and they got behind the wagons, it was a siege warfare.
Right.
The Utes got on the high ground and fired into it and got as close as they could,
And killed all the horses and mules.
Yeah, the first night or two, and they used some of those to, as cover too, and it made it kind of hard with those dead animals around there, and was hardly any water to replenish
right.
from the creek. It was those 6 days had to be pretty tough, and there'd be the trenches in the center of the wagon circle were for the wounded, and whenever a horse would walk by one of those trenches, the Utes would shoot the horse and it'd fall in with the wounded and cause all kinds of grief.
So Fort D.A. Russell, now F.E. Warren Air Force Base, just west of Cheyenne, played a major role, or at least a detachment from Fort D.A. Russell. Can you tell us about how that came about?
Yeah, when White River Expedition was put together, Thornburgh needed 2 companies of cavalry from Fort D.A. Russell, and that's where the 5th Cavalry units came from. When they needed relief, Colonel Wesley Merritt was commanding officer at D.A. Russell, and he was regimental commander of 5th Cav, and he's the one that put together the relief force, principally of 5th Cavalry, a big battalion, and over twice as many troops in the relief force as Thornburgh had in the original
So about
expedition.
250 troops from Fort D.A. Russell?
Yeah, 20-some officers, 250 troops, and wagons and horses, and they were in much more of a hurry than the original White River expedition because these guys were under fire.
And they took the train from Cheyenne to Fort Steele or Rawlins?
Yeah, it was to Rawlins, and then they disembarked there and went overland down to the battlefield, and they went 170 miles in 2 3/4 days. So they went about 50 miles a day or so, which was over twice, maybe 3 times as fast as the White River expedition. And they didn't lose a single horse or man, so they were in a hurry. And they were guided by Jim Baker. And when they got to Milk Creek, the Utes started to pull back. And the 2 trooper groups met up and started shaking hands and everything, and Merritt decided to camp there for a while and rest up his troops and mend the ones that were behind the barricade. And they went upstream a mile or 2 until they found water in the creek and camped there with 2 or 3 times as many troops as Thornburgh had originally, which led me to wonder, well, why the heck didn't Thornburgh just go up there and camp instead of cross onto the reservation? And I lay some of that responsibility at Joe Rankin's feet.
Well, it was interesting that at every juncture there seemed to have been an opportunity where this whole thing could have been avoided. And I had a question for you about the timeline. Meeker was very concerned about his personal safety, and the detachment crossed Milk Creek on September 29th, but on that same day, what happened to Meeker and his white employees?
Well, the Merritt's column didn't know what happened until a few days later, but as soon as the fight broke out at Milk Creek against Thornburgh's command and the Utes sent runners to the agency, and Douglas, who was the Ute leader at the agency at the time, got word of that, and the Utes there killed all the men and took the women and children hostage that same day.
So Meeker and I think 10 of his employees, his white male employees, were killed.
Yes, I think just all of them were, and one of the individuals was taking a note back to Thornburgh from Meeker, and he was killed on the road, and the note said, "Okay, I'll come out and meet you."
Jeez.
So it was a little day late and a dollar short.
Communications failed.
Mm-hmm. And when the dust settled on all this, of course, the government held some hearings.
As they always do, right?
Like they always do.
And a committee.
Yeah. And they brought no charges against any of the Ute for the incidents at Milk Creek during the battle. That was considered an act of war, and it was recognized that it was precipitated by a maneuver, a military maneuver that really was the catalyst for it. They didn't see what happened at the agency in the same light, and they held Douglas responsible for the murder of the civilians, and they put him in jail. And he spent prison, I think it was at Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth, for a year or so, but kind of lost his mind and stuff, and they eventually let him out. But that was the only prosecution.
I thought it was pretty well brought out in your book. You called it a hollow victory, that no one really won that fight, even though the Utes may have prevailed in the actual fighting. But the atmosphere for the Utes in Colorado at that time, the whites were very hostile, and as you mentioned, to the Utes, and you mentioned earlier that their land was very productive, very fertile soil. So what happened is the Utes were pushed off the reservation, correct?
Yeah, within a couple years after Mill Creek, they were moved to a reservation in Utah. The White River Utes were moved out of there, and it was one of the best reservations around in terms of the climate and environment.
Right.
And so they may have won the battle, but they lost the war.
Right. Well, kind of a sad story, actually. So, Dr. Miller, I want to thank you very much for coming over from Laramie, or Woods Landing, I guess, your retirement
Close
home.
enough, yeah.
And walking through this White River expedition and the fight at Milk Creek. Thank you very much.
Happy to do it, and it's a real feather in you guys' cap to have this weapon in your collection that connects people today with the events of the past, and I'm just glad to see that you guys had it.
I didn't mention in introducing you that you were at one time and retired from the position as the state archaeologist, and retired about the same time I did in 2014.
Yeah, I was that state archaeologist for 30 years. So.
Wow. Well, again, thanks very much.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. If you want to know more about the battle at Milk Creek, I highly recommend this book. And again, it is available on interlibrary loan from a couple of different sources. There are other books out there. This one is the best. There's one out there that is just terrible. So I recommend this one by Dr. Miller. If you have any comments or questions, you can attach those in the comments below, or you could contact us through the Wyoming State Museum, and we'll try to help you with more information or answer your questions. Thanks very much for watching this very special edition of Firearms Friday.